They say a marriage is built on a foundation of quiet compromises, but no one ever warns you about the sheer weight of the compromises you make, completely in silence. My name is Sarah. I am 35 years old. For the past 7 years, I have been married to a man who truly believed my exhaustion was just a character flaw. We lived in a beautiful suburban home. It was the kind of house with manicured lawns and large windows that let in the bright morning light. From the outside, our life looked perfectly balanced. Inside, however, the foundation of our marriage had been slowly fracturing for years. The final breaking point did not arrive with a loud scream or a shattered plate. It arrived on a mundane Tuesday evening, wrapped in a cloud of expensive cologne and unearned arrogance. I was sitting at the large kitchen island. I wore my favourite oversized sweater and comfortable sweatpants. I was quietly reviewing complex data analytics for a major corporate client. My laptop screen cast a soft blue glow across the marble countertop. I operated my own consulting firm right from this kitchen. I was highly successful, bringing in well over $500,000 every single year. But my husband Mark preferred to believe a completely different reality. The front door swung open and Mark walked into the hallway. He was 38 years old, but tonight he carried himself like an arrogant teenager who had just won a prize. He threw his leather briefcase onto the entryway table with a loud thud. He strutted into the kitchen, unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket and pouring himself a glass of expensive bourbon. He had just received a promotion to a senior director position at his logistics company. Earlier that morning I had fallen asleep at this very kitchen table, my hand wrapped around a completely cold cup of coffee. I had stayed up until 3 in the morning finalizing a massive project just so I could be awake at 6 to make his breakfast. But he did not see the cold coffee or the dark circles under my eyes. He only saw a wife who was not dressed in a corporate suit. He leaned against the counter and let out a heavy sigh. He looked me up and down, taking in my messy hair and my comfortable clothes. His eyes held a flicker of absolute dismissal. He took a sip of his drink and smiled a deeply patronizing smile. "I need to protect my assets, Sarah," he announced, his voice filling the quiet kitchen. "I am moving up in the corporate world now, and the pressure is immense." I stopped typing and looked up at him. I could see the false sense of superiority radiating from his posture. Mark genuinely believed he was the sole provider for our family. Because I worked from home and never boasted about my massive consulting contracts, he assumed my income barely covered my own groceries. For years I had quietly paid the property taxes, the soaring utility bills and the premium health insurance. I kept our lives perfectly afloat while letting him play the role of the traditional breadwinner simply to protect his fragile ego. "I cannot keep subsidizing your little freelance hobbies," he continued, completely oblivious to the reality of his own life. "You sit around the house all day and I am exhausted from carrying this family financially. It is time we implement a strict 50-50 split on every single expense in this house." His words hung in the warm air of the kitchen. A deep, heavy wave of sadness washed over me. I looked at the man I loved, the man I had secretly supported for nearly a decade, and realized he did not see my value at all. He only saw his own reflection. He wanted a 50-50 split, and he was about to get exactly what he asked for. I did not scream, and I did not cry. I looked down at my hands resting on the cool marble of the kitchen island. I could feel the heavy, invisible weight of the past 7 years pressing down on my shoulders. I thought about the late nights, the quiet transfers of money to his checking account, and the endless emotional management I performed just to keep him comfortable. He stood there holding his glass of bourbon, waiting for an apology or a panic attack. He expected me to beg for his financial mercy. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath. I let the cold reality of his words settle into my bones. "Fine, Mark," I said softly, my voice completely steady. "If a strict 50-50 split is what you need to feel secure, then we will start tomorrow morning." He blinked clearly. Surprised by my lack of resistance, he gave a sharp, triumphant nod, as if he had just won a major corporate negotiation. He turned his back to me, walked into the living room and turned on the television. He did not ask about my day or the dark circles under my eyes. He simply settled into the imported leather sofa, a piece of furniture I had purchased with my own quiet earnings. I remained seated at the kitchen island for a long time. The house was quiet, save for the muffled sounds of the sports broadcast coming from the other room. A profound, undeniable shift occurred inside my chest. It was not a sudden explosion of anger. It was a quiet, deliberate closing of a door. For years I had been the invisible glue holding our lives together. I had smoothed over his missed deadlines, covered his impulsive spending, and managed every single domestic detail so he could focus on climbing his corporate ladder. I reached out and slowly closed my laptop. The blue light vanished, leaving me in the dim warmth of the kitchen. I stood up and gathered my empty coffee mug and my notebooks. Normally at this hour I would begin prepping the coffee maker for his early morning routine. I would lay out his favourite suit, check his calendar for important meetings, and pack a healthy lunch in his leather satchel. It was a routine built on deep affection and a desire to make his life easier. Tonight I walked past the coffee maker without stopping. I rinsed my own mug in the sink and placed it on the drying rack. I did not check his calendar, and I did not open the refrigerator to prepare his lunch. The emotional safety net that had caught him every time he stumbled was officially removed. I walked up the carpeted stairs to our bedroom. I felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, but also a strange new clarity. I realized that my silent sacrifices had not built a strong partnership. They had only fostered his profound entitlement. By constantly overcompensating, I had allowed him to remain completely blind to the actual cost of his own life. As I changed into my pajamas, my mind began to organize the reality of his demand. The sheer logistics of untangling our lives were staggering. I thought about the automatic payment settings on my primary business account. The electricity, the water, the high-speed internet and the comprehensive auto insurance for his car were all silently drawn from my funds every single month. He never saw a single bill. He never experienced the anxiety of a late fee. He lived in a completely subsidized bubble constructed entirely by my hard work. I pulled the heavy duvet over my shoulders. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the television downstairs. I love my husband, but I was done being a ghost in my own marriage. I was done shrinking myself just to make him feel tall. The friction had been sparked, and I knew the consequences would be severe. I closed my eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. The sadness was still there, a dull ache in the centre of my chest. It is a terrible thing to realize the person you love the most views you as a financial burden. But beneath the sadness, a quiet, resolute strength began to take root. I would not argue. I would not complain. I would simply step out of his way and let the natural consequences of his arrogance fall exactly where they belonged. Tomorrow he would wake up to a world that required his actual participation. The invisible burden was finally lifted from my shoulders, and the true weight of our life was about to land directly on his. The next morning the house was incredibly still. I woke up at exactly 5:00. The early morning light was just beginning to filter through the heavy bedroom curtains. Mark was still sleeping heavily tangled in the warm white duvet. I slipped out of bed, my feet touching the cold hardwood floor, and walked softly downstairs to the kitchen. It was time to honour his 50-50 rule with absolute unflinching precision. I brewed a single cup of green tea for myself. I did not make a full pot of dark roast coffee for him. I did not lay out his favourite travel mug or set a clean spoon on a folded napkin. I sat at the marble kitchen island, opened my laptop and created a fresh spreadsheet. For years I had quietly absorbed the massive cost of keeping our expansive pantry fully stocked. I drove to the premium grocery store in our suburb every single Sunday. I purchased organic produce, lean proteins, and the expensive imported cheeses that Mark loved to eat after a long day at the office. He never once looked at a grocery receipt. He never asked how much a prime cut of steak actually cost. Today I was going to change the entire landscape of our kitchen. I drove to the local store and filled my canvas bags with exactly what I needed for my own meals. I bought fresh salmon, crisp vegetables, and my favourite herbal teas. I spent exactly $140. When I returned home, I carried the heavy bags into the bright kitchen. I did not just put the food away on the shelves. I opened a small desk drawer and took out a roll of bright red adhesive circular labels. I stood in front of the open refrigerator, feeling the cool air against my face, and began my meticulous work. I placed a red sticker on the carton of expensive almond milk. I placed a red sticker on the fresh berries and the sealed packages of wild-caught salmon. I moved to the dry pantry and placed a red sticker on my premium coffee beans, my favourite protein bars and the imported pasta. I even went through the existing items we had purchased previously. I carefully marked the expensive olive oil, the high-end sparkling water and the dark chocolate hidden on the top shelf. I left his cheap domestic beer, a half-empty jar of mustard, and a loaf of white bread completely untouched. Everything else was clearly marked as my personal property. It felt petty for a brief moment, but it was exactly what he had demanded. Separate lives required separate expenses. I closed the pantry doors, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and profound liberation. Next, I sat back down at my computer to tackle the monthly household overhead. I downloaded the latest financial statements for the electricity, the water, the municipal trash collection, and the high-speed internet. For years, these bills had simply vanished from my corporate checking account, paid automatically without a single complaint. I calculated the total sum, divided it by exactly 2, and formulated a pristine, itemized invoice. I printed the document on thick, heavy paper and left it sitting on the kitchen counter, directly next to his car keys. Around 7 o'clock I heard his heavy footsteps coming down the carpeted stairs. Mark walked into the kitchen, wearing his crisp blue dress shirt and tailored grey trousers. He looked sleep-deprived and slightly confused. He walked straight to the coffee maker, expecting to find a fresh pot of dark roast waiting for him. The glass carafe was completely empty and stone cold. He let out a loud, frustrated sigh, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He opened the refrigerator, intending to grab some milk for his morning cereal. I watched silently from the kitchen island, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my green tea. He stopped abruptly, staring at the absolute sea of bright red stickers covering almost every edible item inside the bright fridge. He picked up a small container of organic yogurt, peeled the bright red sticker off with a dramatic scoff, and tossed the sticky paper onto the pristine kitchen floor. "What is this absolute nonsense, Sarah?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescending annoyance. "Are we really playing childish games with the groceries now?" I did not raise my voice, and I did not look away from my laptop screen. "You asked for a strict 50-50 financial split, Mark," I replied calmly. "I am simply ensuring that we keep our personal assets clearly separated. The items with red stickers belong exclusively to my half of the household budget." Mark rolled his eyes, a classic defensive gesture he used whenever he felt slightly inconvenienced. He poured himself a glass of tap water, entirely ignoring the deep emotional chasm that was rapidly opening between us. He truly believed this was just a temporary, pathetic temper tantrum. He thought I was pouting, and that I would inevitably fold by the end of the week, returning to my quiet, submissive role as his domestic manager. He picked up his heavy car keys from the counter and noticed the printed invoice resting underneath them. He scanned the black numbers quickly, completely blinding himself to the actual cost of his daily comfortable lifestyle. He scoffed again, folding the thick paper in half and shoving it carelessly into his expensive leather briefcase. "I will transfer the money later," he muttered, completely missing the heavy reality of the document he had just touched. He walked toward the front hallway, adjusting his silk tie in the large decorative mirror. He did not say goodbye. He did not kiss my cheek. He just walked out the front door, stepping blindly into a harsh financial reality he was entirely unprepared to handle. I sat in the quiet kitchen, looking at the discarded red sticker on the floor. The comfortable routine was beginning to unravel, and he was entirely too arrogant to even notice the fraying edges. The sound of the heavy front door clicking shut echoed through the quiet house. I remained seated at the kitchen island, staring at the empty space where my husband had just been standing. He thought the 50-50 split only applied to electricity bills and organic yogurt. He had no idea how deeply his life was subsidized by my quiet, invisible labor. It was time to show him the true, overwhelming cost of his own arrogance. I opened my laptop again and navigated to my primary banking application. For the past 5 years, I had maintained a premium travel credit card. It was a heavy metal card that came with exorbitant annual fees and exclusive lounge access. I kept it primarily for my extensive corporate travel. However, when Mark was promoted to a junior director 2 years ago, he complained about needing a card that looked impressive to his colleagues. I had quietly added him as an authorized user. He used that heavy metal card constantly. He used it to buy expensive rounds of drinks at the local golf course and to pay for lavish business lunches he claimed he would eventually be reimbursed for. Every month the massive balance would quietly auto-deduct directly from my consulting revenue account. He never saw a single statement. He never felt the sting of a declined transaction. I took a slow, deep breath and clicked on the Authorized Users tab. His name sat there in bold digital letters. With a single click of my mouse, I formally removed him from the account. A small window popped up asking for a reason for the removal. I selected the option for lost or stolen, which felt entirely appropriate. The heavy piece of metal sitting in his expensive leather wallet was now completely useless. I did not stop with the credit cards. I moved meticulously through my financial dashboard. I found the recurring monthly charge for his exclusive gym membership. It was a high-end athletic club that cost over $200 a month. I had set it up on auto-pay years ago as a birthday gift. I promptly cancelled the recurring transfer. If he wanted to sweat in a luxury sauna, he was going to have to input his own billing information. I went after the daily unacknowledged conveniences next. I logged into the master account for our television streaming services. I changed the primary passwords and logged out all connected devices. When he wanted to collapse on the imported sofa tonight and watch his favourite premium shows, he would be greeted by a bright, demanding login screen. The final task was the most significant. I navigated to my premium auto insurance portal. When Mark leased his new luxury sedan last year, he simply handed me the dealership paperwork and told me to add it to the household policy. The monthly premium for a driver with his aggressive habits on a high-performance vehicle was absolutely astronomical. Because he never looked at our joint finances, he never realized I was paying the entire cost myself. With a profound sense of calm, I clicked the button to modify the policy. I formally removed his vehicle and his name entirely from my auto insurance coverage. He was officially on his own. If he got pulled over, or if the leasing company ran a mandatory audit, he would be driving entirely uninsured. I was meticulously dismantling the comfortable, subsidized infrastructure of his entire life, one click at a time. The afternoon passed in a blur of quiet, focused work. I completed my consulting reports and sent them off to my corporate clients. Around 6:00, the front door opened again. Mark walked in looking significantly more exhausted than when he had left. He dropped his briefcase on the floor and loosened his silk tie. "I am starving," he announced to the empty hallway. He walked into the kitchen, entirely ignoring my presence at the island. He opened the pantry and reached for a bag of premium protein chips. He stopped noticing the bright red sticker securely fastened to the front of the bag. He let out a loud, frustrated groan and slammed the pantry door shut. He walked over to the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of his cheap domestic beer. He twisted the cap off and took a long, desperate sip. "Did you pay the internet bill today, Sarah?" he asked, his tone dripping with accusation. "My phone is not connecting to the wireless network." I looked up from my screen and offered a perfectly polite smile. "I paid exactly half of the internet bill, Marky," I replied softly. "However, since we are dividing everything strictly down the middle, I changed the network password to protect my half of the bandwidth. I will happily write the new password down for you as soon as your portion of the utility invoice clears my bank account." Mark stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and rising anger. He truly could not comprehend the reality of the situation. He thought a 50-50 split meant I would keep doing all the administrative work, while he simply handed over a fraction of the cost whenever he felt like it. "This is completely ridiculous," he snapped, his voice echoing in the kitchen. "I am a senior director, Sarah. I do not have time to play these petty roommate games with you. Just give me the password so I can check my emails." I slowly shook my head. "You demanded these rules, Mark," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I am simply following your exact instructions. The invoice is sitting right there, in your briefcase." He glared at me for a long, tense moment. He was waiting for me to apologize, to back down, to return to the submissive wife he was used to ignoring. When I did not flinch, he let out a string of angry curses under his breath. He turned around and stormed into the living room. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of the television turning on. Then absolute silence. He had hit the login screen. I heard him throw the remote control onto the glass coffee table with a loud, aggressive clatter. The comfortable, effortless routine he had enjoyed for years was finally unravelling. He was sitting in the dark, disconnected, and completely unaware that the real financial storm had not even begun to hit him yet. The following day began with a false sense of triumph for my husband. Mark arrived at his corporate office wearing his tailored suit, completely ignoring the quiet tension he left behind at home. He spent the morning answering emails and basking in the glow of his new senior director title. He truly believed that his financial discomfort the previous night was just a small bump in the road. He was a successful man, and successful men did not worry about internet passwords or grocery stickers. At exactly noon, Mark walked out of his glass office. He had invited 2 junior logistics managers to lunch. He wanted to play the role of the generous, wealthy mentor. He took them to a high-end downtown steakhouse. It was a restaurant with dim lighting, white tablecloths, and waiters wearing crisp black ties. Mark walked in acting as if he owned the entire building. He demanded a secluded corner booth and immediately ordered a bottle of imported wine without even opening the menu. For the first 45 minutes, Mark held court. He bragged loudly about his recent promotion and his strategic vision for the company. He leaned across the table, offering unsolicited advice to the younger men. He painted a picture of himself as a heavy-hitting corporate titan who carried the weight of the entire industry on his shoulders. The junior managers nodded politely, eating their expensive cuts of beef and laughing at his jokes. Mark felt absolutely invincible. When the waiter brought the black leather folder containing the check, Mark did not even flinch. He knew the bill would be well over $300. He reached into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out his leather wallet. He slid out the heavy premium travel card. He dropped it onto the small silver tray with a loud, distinct clatter. He wanted the young managers to see the premium branding and the heavy metal. He wanted them to know he was in a completely different tax bracket. The waiter nodded and walked away toward the register. Mark returned his attention to his colleagues, continuing a story about a massive shipping contract he was supposedly managing. He took a slow sip of his expensive wine, feeling like the absolute king of his domain. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned. He did not have a pen for Mark to sign the receipt. The waiter leaned down and whispered discreetly into Mark's ear. "I am incredibly sorry, sir," the waiter murmured politely, "but the system is declining this card." Mark let out a loud, dismissive scoff. He waved his hand in the air, trying to brush off the embarrassment. "Run the chip again," Mark commanded, his voice carrying across the quiet dining room. "The machine must be faulty." The waiter nodded nervously and walked away again. The two junior managers looked down at their empty plates, a heavy, awkward silence settling over the table. Mark chuckled nervously, telling them that corporate banking security was always too strict. He tried to maintain his arrogant posture, but a small bead of sweat formed on his forehead. When the waiter came back a second time, the restaurant manager was walking right beside him. The manager leaned in and spoke in a very clear, professional tone. "I apologize for the inconvenience," the manager said softly, "but the issuing bank has flagged this card as entirely invalid. The primary account holder has revoked the authorization." Mark felt all the blood drain from his face. His stomach tied itself into a heavy, cold knot. The primary account holder. He suddenly remembered my calm face from the night before. He remembered me telling him I was separating our personal assets. He had completely forgotten that the heavy metal card, the symbol of his supposed wealth, belonged entirely to my consulting business. The junior managers stopped smiling. They looked at him with a mixture of confusion and quiet pity. Mark scrambled to open his wallet again. His hands were visibly trembling. He pulled out his own personal bank card and handed it over. He prayed silently that his own modest checking account could cover the massive lunch bill. The manager walked away with the personal card. Mark sat in complete silence, staring at the white tablecloth. He could not look at his colleagues. The grand illusion of his wealth was rapidly cracking. 2 minutes later, the manager returned, shaking his head apologetically. "I am so sorry, sir," the manager stated firmly, "but this secondary card is also declining due to insufficient funds." Absolute panic fully set in. Mark was trapped in a luxury restaurant with an unpaid bill and absolutely zero access to money. He had spent his entire morning acting like a millionaire, and now he was completely exposed as a fraud. He had to swallow his immense pride right in front of the young men he was desperately trying to impress. Mark cleared his throat, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He looked at the junior manager sitting across from him. "I seem to be having a massive banking error today," Mark stammered, his voice cracking with humiliation. "Could you possibly cover this check for me? I will wire you the funds the minute we get back to the office." The young manager looked shocked, but quickly pulled out his own simple debit card and handed it to the waiter. The humiliation was absolute and completely suffocating. Mark sat there, while his subordinate paid for the lavish meal he had arrogantly organized. The walk back to the corporate office was completely silent. Mark did not tell any more stories. He did not offer any more mentorship advice. He practically ran to the elevator, desperate to hide in his office. He locked his door, sat at his desk, and pulled up his personal banking application on his phone. He stared at his screen, completely horrified. His checking account balance was barely enough to cover a tank of gas. His personal credit cards were completely maxed out from his previous secret hotel bookings and expensive golf outings. He had been so entirely focused on my supposed financial insignificance that he never realized I was the only thing keeping him from total bankruptcy. The massive financial safety net had been completely cut away, and he was finally in a devastating free fall. The fallout from my precise financial restructuring did not stop at Mark and his bruised ego. The very next morning, the consequences reached far beyond the walls of his corporate office and spilled directly into the lap of his family. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing a complex wireframe layout for a major tech client. I had a fresh cup of artisan green tea steaming gently next to my tablet. The profound peace of my morning was abruptly shattered by the sound of the front door flying open. Mark had always refused to take back the spare key that we gave his mother for emergencies. Today, Clara decided a minor social inconvenience completely qualified as a massive family emergency. Clara stomped into my kitchen like a hurricane wrapped in pastel cashmere. She carried a genuine leather designer handbag that I had ironically purchased for her birthday just last year. She slammed the heavy bag down onto the pristine quartz countertop with enough force to make my ceramic mug rattle. Her face was flushed a deep, mottled crimson. She was breathing heavily, and her perfectly sprayed blonde hair trembled with every outraged exhale. I did not look up from my screen immediately. I let her stand there and stew in her own aggressive energy before I slowly turned my gaze to meet hers. "What on earth is wrong with you, Sarah?" she shrieked. Her shrill voice echoed off the high ceilings of my house. I was just at the Oak Ridge Country Club hosting a very important charity luncheon with the board committee. Do you have any idea how completely humiliated I was when the club manager pulled me aside in front of everyone? He told me my premium family membership had been entirely deactivated due to non-payment. He actually asked me to provide a new card or leave the private dining room. She paced back and forth, waving her manicured hands in the air. I had to excuse myself and claim there was a banking error. She continued, her voice rising in pitch. "How could you let Mark account fall into such disrepair? You are supposed to be managing the administrative chores around here because he is so incredibly busy providing for you." I listened to her entire frantic monologue without changing my expression for a single second. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my green tea. The warm, earthy flavour tasted particularly excellent this morning. I gently set the mug down and folded my hands neatly on the table. I did not let Mark account fall into disrepair. "Clara," I replied, in a voice so calm it seemed to infuriate her even more. I simply stopped paying for it myself. Clara stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. She blinked rapidly, trying to process the simple information. "What do you mean you stopped paying for it?" she demanded. "Mark earns a fantastic salary. He just got promoted to a senior director. You just need to log in and authorize the payment from his checking account." I smiled warmly at her. It was the kind of smile that promised absolute destruction of her fabricated reality. I took a deep breath and systematically dismantled the lie she had proudly paraded around her affluent social circle for the past 3 years. Mark does not pay for the Oak Ridge Country Club membership. Clara, I explained clearly and slowly so she would not miss a single syllable. He has never paid for it. The $1,200 monthly fee has always been billed directly to my corporate consulting account. I watched her eyes widen in pure shock as the truth hit her. It was a luxury perk I provided. I continued smoothly because I know how much you love showing off to your friends at the tennis courts. However, your son came home 2 nights ago and demanded a strict 50-50 split on all financial responsibilities. He explicitly stated he was tired of carrying me and wanted everything divided evenly. I am simply honouring his new household rules. I cancelled the membership because it is an unnecessary luxury for my half of the budget. If you want to keep lunching with the board committee, I suggest you drive straight to Mark office and ask your highly successful son to foot the bill. Clara literally staggered backward. She gripped the edge of the kitchen island to steady herself. The sheer shock of realizing that the quiet daughter-in-law she constantly belittled was actually the sole financial sponsor of her elite lifestyle hit her like a freight train. She opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely nothing came out. She looked around my expansive kitchen, taking in the custom cabinetry and the high-end appliances, as if seeing them for the very first time. She suddenly realized the entire illusion of her son being wealthy was funded by the woman she was currently screaming at. But Clara was a master of psychological manipulation. Instead of apologizing or showing a single shred of gratitude for the thousands of dollars I had spent subsidizing her social life, she immediately pivoted to an aggressive defense. Her shock quickly morphed into vicious, toxic gaslighting. "You are a deeply selfish woman, Sarah," she hissed, narrowing her eyes. "You are trying to emasculate my son because you are jealous of his new promotion. A good wife supports her husband. She does not play petty financial games just to undermine his confidence. Mark works incredibly hard at his logistics company. He is building a real career while you sit around the house all day playing on your computer. If you had any respect for the institution of marriage, you would not be keeping score like a greedy roommate." Her words were specifically designed to make me feel guilty and small. It was the exact same tactic she had used on Mark, his entire life moulding him into the entitled, arrogant man he was today. But her psychological tricks had absolutely zero effect on me anymore. I was completely immune to her toxicity. I stood up slowly from my bar stool. I looked down at her and let the absolute zero temperature of my boundaries freeze her in place. "This is not a negotiation, Clara," I stated firmly, my voice echoing in the large room. "The financial free ride is permanently over. I strongly suggest you take your designer bag and exit my property before I have to ask you to leave. And please leave the spare key on the counter. You will not be needing it anymore." Clara practically vibrated with rage. She snatched her heavy leather bag off the counter with a dramatic flourish. "You are going to regret this," she threatened, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "When Mark realizes what a vindictive, spiteful woman he married, he will leave you with absolutely nothing." She spun around on her expensive heels and marched toward the front door. She slammed it shut behind her so hard the framed artwork on the hallway walls rattled. I watched her luxury sedan speed aggressively out of my driveway. I walked over to the kitchen counter, picked up the spare silver key she had slammed down, and dropped it directly into the trash can. The second layer of my husband-fake empire had just crumbled to dust, and the silence in my house was absolutely beautiful. Mark returned home that evening looking like a man who had just chewed on broken glass. His mother had clearly called him the very second she peeled her luxury sedan out of my driveway. He slammed the front door so hard the walls vibrated. I was sitting on the living room sofa, calmly reviewing a contract on my tablet. He marched directly toward me, and his face was twisted into an ugly snarl. "You had absolutely no right to humiliate my mother at her club," he screamed. His veins were visibly popping out of his neck. "You are a petty, vindictive woman, and you are trying to ruin my family reputation," he yelled. I simply stared back at him, my expression perfectly neutral. I calmly reminded him that I was only following the strict financial boundaries that he had explicitly demanded. He paced the hardwood floor, his mind desperately searching for a way to assert dominance. He needed to punish me. He needed to find a vulnerability to exploit, so I would be forced to beg for his mercy. Then I saw a malicious spark light up his eyes. He remembered the one single utility bill that actually bore his name. When we first moved in, he had insisted on setting up the residential internet service because he wanted to bundle it with an expensive sports television package. Mark let out a loud, mocking laugh. He pointed a finger at me and declared that if we were truly operating under a split household, I was no longer permitted to use his network to run my little freelance business. He turned on his heel and stormed down the hallway to the utility closet. I heard the sound of plastic snapping and wires being violently yanked from the wall. A moment later, he emerged holding the primary wireless router, high in the air like a trophy. "Since you want to be so independent, you can figure out how to deliver your little projects without a connection," he sneered. He grabbed his keys, gave me a sickeningly smug grin, and walked out the door to drown his sorrows at a local suburban bar. He genuinely believed he had just dealt a fatal blow to my career. He thought I would be sitting in the dark, crying, and completely unable to meet my corporate deadlines. I did not shed a single tear. I did not even sigh. I calmly picked up my smartphone, activated my mobile hotspot, and connected my laptop. I had corporate deadlines to meet, and a missing residential router was nothing but a minor speed bump. I opened my browser and navigated to the website of the most reliable commercial fibre optic provider in the city. I did not order a standard home package. I requested a dedicated ultra-high-speed business line. My consulting firm had stellar credit, and I was willing to pay a premium fee for emergency expedited service. The telecommunications company dispatched a commercial technician to my property within 2 hours. The technician arrived in a branded van and got straight to work. I directed him to bypass the main utility closet entirely and run the heavy-duty fibre optic cable directly into my home office. By early evening, I had a blazing, fast, secure enterprise-grade network connection completely isolated from the rest of the physical house. It was a connection Mark would never be able to access because it was password protected and registered solely under my corporate entity. But I was not quite finished upgrading my workspace. Mark had proven that he was willing to destroy property and disrupt my workflow just to throw a tantrum. I needed to establish a hard physical boundary. I called a local commercial locksmith. Within the hour, the standard wooden door knob on my office was replaced with a heavy-duty biometric keypad lock. The reinforced steel mechanism required a fingerprint scan for entry. My home office was now an impenetrable fortress. I sat back in my newly secured room and looked at the heavy steel lock on the door. The emotional distance between us had just become a tangible physical barrier. For years my office door was always open, welcoming him in whenever he needed a sounding board or a shoulder to lean on. Now I was locked safely inside, completely separated from the toxic energy he was bringing into our home. He had ripped a plastic router out of the wall, thinking he was a tactical genius. In response, I had fortified my income stream and locked down my physical workspace. The petty, childish war he thought he could win was slipping entirely out of his grasp. The silence in the house was profound, and the canyon growing between us was finally becoming too wide to cross. The next morning, the adrenaline of the previous day finally faded. I sat in my secure office, looking out the large window at the quiet suburban street. The physical boundaries were in place, but the emotional toll was beginning to feel unbearably heavy. I had spent 7 years pouring my entire soul into a marriage that was currently dissolving over an internet router and a grocery bill. I needed to speak the truth out loud to someone who actually knew the man I had married. I picked up my smartphone and dialed Emily. Emily was Mark's younger sister, but she was entirely different from him and their mother. She was a pragmatic, grounded public school teacher, who had always viewed her family's obsession with status with a healthy dose of quiet skepticism. She answered on the third ring. I asked if she had time for a quick coffee, and she immediately agreed, sensing the heavy exhaustion in my voice. We met at a small independent cafe on the far edge of town. It was a quiet place filled with trailing green plants and the rich smell of roasted espresso. I found Emily sitting at a small wooden table near the back. She wore a simple knit sweater, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She stood up and wrapped me in a warm, genuine hug. I ordered my herbal tea and sat down across from her. I did not know exactly how to begin, so I simply started from the very beginning. I told Emily about the Tuesday night when Mark arrogantly demanded the strict 50-50 split. I watched her dark eyes widen in sheer disbelief as I calmly detailed the absolute reality of her brother's financial situation. I explained that I owned the consulting firm that paid for the premium health insurance, the soaring property taxes, and the expensive auto policy for his luxury car. I told her about the heavy metal travel card and how I had been quietly paying off his lavish business lunches for the past 2 years. I explained how the burden was not just financial, but deeply physically exhausting. I described the countless nights I stayed awake until 3 a.m, finishing my corporate contracts, just so I could wake up at 6 to pack his lunch and manage his daily schedule. I told her about the cold cups of coffee, the silent anxiety, and the profound loneliness of carrying a family entirely by myself. Emily sat completely still, her hands wrapped tightly around her ceramic mug. "You have been carrying him this entire time?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet, profound sadness. "He genuinely has no idea that you are the one funding his entire life." I nodded slowly, letting a single tear finally escape down my cheek. "I never wanted to emasculate him, Emily," I whispered, wiping the tear away with a paper napkin. I knew he struggled with his confidence when we first met. He wanted so desperately to be the traditional provider, and I wanted him to feel proud. So I just quietly paid the big bills and let him think his salary was covering everything. I thought I was being a supportive wife, but I was just building a massive, fragile illusion. Emily reached across the small table and placed her warm hand over mine. "He called me this morning, Sarah," she confessed, her voice thick with absolute disgust. "He was screaming about you locking him out of the internet and embarrassing our mother at the country club. He sounded so incredibly entitled and angry. I knew something was fundamentally wrong because Mark has always been deeply insecure, and loud people are usually hiding massive failures." I let out a shaky breath, feeling the crushing weight of the secret finally lifting from my chest. "It is not just the money, Emily," I explained, looking down at my cooling tea. "It is the absolute profound emotional exhaustion. I am so tired of being the invisible shock absorber for his entire life. I am tired of making sure his suits are pressed. His ego is stroked and his bank accounts are balanced, while he looks at me and tells me I am just a financial burden. He does not see me. He has not actually seen me in years." Emily squeezed my hand firmly. She did not defend her brother, and she did not make pathetic excuses for his toxic behaviour. She looked at me with deep, unwavering respect. "You did exactly what you had to do, Sarah," she stated clearly, leaving no room for doubt. "You stopped setting yourself on fire just to keep him warm. He is a grown man, and it is entirely past time he faced the actual consequences of his own arrogance." We sat in the quiet cafe for another hour. We did not discuss legal strategies or divorce proceedings. We just talked about the painful hidden reality of carrying an unequal partnership. Emily validated every single ounce of my exhaustion. She made me feel seen and heard in a way my husband had never managed to achieve. When we finally walked out of the cafe into the bright afternoon sunlight, I felt a renewed sense of profound strength. Emily hugged me tightly, promising to keep our conversation entirely confidential. She told me to stand my ground and absolutely refuse to back down. I drove back to my quiet, secure house, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead of us. The major family barbecue was approaching this weekend, and the fragile house of cards Mark had built was completely destined to fall. 2 days after my quiet coffee with Emily, the weekend finally arrived. It was the afternoon of the annual family barbecue. Emily and her husband David were hosting the event in their sprawling suburban backyard. The atmosphere in my house that morning was suffocatingly tense. Mark had barely spoken to me since the night he ripped the internet router from the wall. He was wrapping himself in a blanket of icy resentment, acting like a wounded king who had been unfairly exiled. Despite the absolute hostility radiating from him, he insisted we ride to the party together. He desperately needed to project the image of a powerful executive arriving with his perfectly submissive wife. We pulled into Emily's wide driveway. Mark was driving his leased luxury sedan. He revved the powerful engine unnecessarily loud, making sure everyone in the backyard knew he had arrived. He stepped out of the car, wearing expensive designer sunglasses and a crisp linen shirt. He walked around to the trunk and pulled out a massive, heavy thermal cooler. He had spent the entire morning hyping up his spectacular contribution to the family cookout. He strutted through the wooden side gate, commanding the attention of the entire yard, carrying the cooler like a literal chest of gold. I followed quietly behind him. I wore a simple, elegant sundress. I carried a bottle of sparkling water and found a quiet seat in the shade. Clara was already holding court on the patio, sipping a cocktail. She shot me a venomous glare the moment I stepped onto the grass. She had clearly briefed the extended family on my supposed financial rebellion. She wanted everyone to believe I was a jealous, bitter wife trying to ruin her highly successful son. Mark marched directly toward the outdoor grill. David, Emily's husband, was meticulously prepping the hot coals. With a highly theatrical flourish, Mark popped open the heavy cooler. He pulled out 4 massive, incredibly expensive cuts of premium imported beef. He loudly announced to the entire yard that he had special ordered the steaks from a high-end butcher downtown. He made absolutely sure to emphasize the exorbitant price tag. He boasted that a single steak cost more than most people made in a full day of hard work. He threw a quick, spiteful glance in my direction. He was desperately trying to prove that my strict financial boundaries had not affected his purchasing power in the slightest. I took a seat on a shaded lounge chair, crossing my legs and resting my hands elegantly in my lap. I accepted a glass of iced tea from Emily and watched the performance unfold. Mark handed the expensive meat to David, clapping him hard on the shoulder with fabricated camaraderie. He raised his voice even louder, making sure his mother heard every single syllable. He began bragging about a massive year-end bonus he was anticipating from his logistics company. He spun a ridiculous, highly exaggerated tale about how his corporate executives were practically begging him to accept an even higher position. He claimed the upcoming bonus would be large enough to buy a vacation home entirely in cash. He was performing directly for me. Every word, every exaggerated gesture, every loud laugh was a desperate, pathetic attempt to establish absolute dominance. He wanted me to feel a crushing wave of regret for enforcing the 50-50 rule. He wanted me to look at his expensive steaks and his luxury car and believe I was losing a highly valuable asset. But as I sat there, sipping my iced tea, I did not feel a single ounce of regret. I felt an overwhelming sense of clinical amusement. It was exactly like watching a tragic play where the lead actor had absolutely no idea the stage was currently engulfed in flames. Clara beamed with immense pride, clapping her hands together and loudly praising her son for being such a spectacular provider. I simply took another slow sip of my drink and offered them a polite, radiant smile. I was the only person in the entire backyard who knew the absolute truth. His personal credit cards were completely maxed out. His checking account was practically empty. His access to my wealth was permanently severed. Those premium steaks were undoubtedly purchased by draining the very last few dollars of his available personal credit. Mark poured himself a generous glass of expensive bourbon. He leaned against the patio railing, soaking in the blind admiration of his mother and his extended relatives. He laughed loudly, tossing his head back, a man entirely consumed by his own fragile ego. He looked directly at me, a smug, challenging smirk plastered on his face. He was daring me to expose him. He was daring me to mention his declined credit card or his unpaid utility bills in front of his adoring audience. I remained perfectly still. I did not interrupt his grand speech. I did not correct his outrageous lies or defend myself against his mother's subtle insults. I simply let him dig his own grave deeper and deeper with every boastful word that spilled from his mouth. I knew that the higher he built this fragile pedestal of lies, the more devastating his eventual fall would be. The emotional climax of his financial facade was rapidly approaching, and I was perfectly content to sit in the shade and wait for gravity to do its job. The thick smoke from the searing beef billowed into the warm afternoon air. David stood methodically rotating the expensive cuts of meat with a pair of heavy stainless steel tongs. David was Emily's husband, and he possessed a mind that naturally organized the chaotic world into neat, undeniable columns of data. He was a senior risk analyst for a massive regional bank. He was a man who traded in absolute facts and verified receipts. He usually managed to survive these loud family gatherings by claiming the grill as his personal sanctuary. It kept him physically occupied and gave him a perfect vantage point to observe the ongoing theatre without being forced to actively participate. Mark swaggered over to the grill, holding his crystal glass of premium bourbon. The alcohol had clearly dissolved whatever thin filter of common sense he normally possessed. He leaned his elbow heavily against the brick veneer of the outdoor kitchen island. He completely invaded David's personal space. Mark desperately needed male validation. He needed someone to acknowledge his fabricated status as an elite corporate titan. Since David was the only other man present with a highly respected professional career, Mark decided to make him the primary audience for his latest financial fairy tale. Mark took a large gulp of his amber liquor and let out a satisfied, aggressive exhale. He leaned in close and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial volume, as if he were sharing highly classified trade secrets. He began boasting about a supposedly massive shipping contract he had secured just 2 weeks prior. He claimed the negotiations had been incredibly tense and required a delicate, personalized touch to push the final paperwork across the finish line. To hear Mark tell it, he single-handedly saved his logistics company from absolute ruin by deploying his unmatched, charismatic charm. But it was the specific details of his story that caused a massive, blaring alarm to trigger inside David's highly analytical brain. Mark proudly puffed out his chest and stated that he had to pull out all the stops for this particular client. He bragged about booking a top-tier luxury suite at a downtown hotel. He enthusiastically detailed the opulent amenities of the room, including the expensive chilled champagne and the ridiculously overpriced room service menu. Mark chuckled darkly and slapped the marble countertop. He loudly proclaimed that he threw the entire lavish weekend directly onto his corporate expense account without a single second of hesitation. He boasted that when you bring in the kind of revenue he does, the executive board simply looks the other way when the expense reports roll in at the end of the month. David did not look up from the sizzling grill. He maintained a perfectly neutral facial expression, but his internal processing speed immediately shifted into overdrive. His mind was an absolute vault of corporate compliance regulations and standard financial operating procedures. The story Mark was so proudly spinning was not just a slight exaggeration. It was a massive, glaring display of irrefutable corporate fraud. David knew the specific logistics firm where Mark was employed. He was intimately familiar with their industry tier and their internal financial structures. Senior directors in that specific sector absolutely do not possess unlimited corporate expense accounts. The days of companies writing blank checks for wild luxury hotel stays had ended decades ago. Modern compliance departments utilize automated software to flag any transaction that falls outside highly specific parameters. Paying for a client dinner at a nice steakhouse was standard business practice. Booking a luxury suite in your own home city for a local client was a catastrophic compliance violation. It was the exact type of reckless transaction that triggers an immediate internal audit. Furthermore, the narrative itself contained fatal logical flaws. A logistics director does not secure a commercial shipping contract by booking a luxury hotel suite for a client. That bordered on bribery and violated countless ethical guidelines within the corporate industry. Yet Mark was standing there, smelling of expensive cologne and cheap lies. He was claiming he casually swiped a corporate card for a weekend of unmitigated luxury. Then Mark made a critical, fatal slip of the tongue. Caught up in the momentum of his own massive ego, he chuckled and mentioned how much the client enjoyed the signature couples massage package he had booked at the hotel spa. He winked at David, saying, "You have to make sure they are totally relaxed before you ask them to sign on the dotted line." David's hands froze on the stainless steel tongs for a fraction of a second. A couples massage. The mathematical equation in David's mind instantly clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Corporate shipping clients do not attend couples massages with their logistics directors. That was not a legitimate business expense. That was a romantic getaway. Mark had not taken a client to the luxury hotel. He had taken a mistress. He was funding an illicit hidden affair using stolen company money. David finally lifted his dark eyes from the grill. He looked directly at Mark. He saw the flushed cheeks, the arrogant smirk, and the utter lack of a moral compass. Mark was so profoundly stupid and so blinded by his own narcissism that he was actively confessing to gross corporate embezzlement in front of a senior risk analyst. He was handing over the exact details entirely unprompted. David slowly turned his head to look across the sunlit patio. He found me sitting gracefully on the shaded lounge chair. I was completely isolated from the rest of the loud family, holding my glass of iced tea with perfect posture. I looked incredibly calm. There was no stress tightening my jaw. I looked like a woman who was patiently waiting for a timer to reach 0. David instantly realized that I already knew. I might not know the exact details of the downtown hotel suite or the stolen corporate funds, but I absolutely knew that the man standing by the grill was a complete and total fraud. David did not say a single word to Mark. He did not offer a congratulatory nod or a fake smile. He simply turned his attention back to the expensive cuts of meat searing over the hot coals. As a professional analyst, he knew that confronting a liar without the physical documents in hand was a tactical error. You never interrupt a reckless man while he is actively providing you with the exact roadmap to his own destruction. David meticulously committed every single detail to his flawless memory. The meat sizzled loudly, sending a fresh wave of smoke into the air. He flipped the steaks with precise, calculated movements. The tension on the patio was growing incredibly heavy, and the inevitable explosion was now only a matter of time. The late afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows across the meticulously manicured lawn. Mark was at the absolute peak of his fabricated glory. He was holding a fresh glass of bourbon, laughing loudly at his own joke and soaking in the attention of his family. Clara was practically glowing with maternal pride, occasionally interjecting to remind everyone about her son and his prestigious new director title. The entire backyard was a symphony of clinking glasses, sizzling meat, and manufactured elite status. I remained seated on my shaded lounge chair, the epitome of relaxed elegance, silently counting down the minutes. I knew that reality has a very strict schedule, and Mark was severely overdue for his appointment. The disruption did not announce itself with a polite knock. It announced itself with the heavy, unmistakable rumble of a massive diesel engine creeping down the quiet, tree-lined street. The low, guttural vibration of the commercial flatbed tow truck cut straight through the upbeat pop music playing from the outdoor speakers. The truck did not just drive past. It stopped abruptly in front of the house, shifted into reverse, and let out a series of loud, piercing, warning beeps. The massive vehicle slowly backed directly into Emily's pristine concrete driveway, stopping mere inches from the gleaming front bumper of Mark's least luxury sedan. Conversations on the patio died instantly. The clinking of glasses ceased. Everyone turned their heads to stare at the driveway in utter bewilderment. 2 men stepped out of the heavy-duty truck. They were burly, wearing high-visibility safety vests and heavy work boots, looking completely out of place in this sea of pastel polo shirts and designer sundresses. They did not look toward the backyard party. They did not ask for permission. They moved with the swift, practiced efficiency of men who repossess luxury assets for a living. The larger of the 2 men walked straight up to the windshield of the sedan. He held a rugged commercial tablet in his hand and quickly scanned the vehicle identification number visible through the glass. The device let out a sharp electronic chirp, confirming a positive match. The second man immediately dropped to the pavement and began positioning the heavy steel wheel lifts under the front tires of the luxury car. Mark froze. The colour drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He dropped his expensive bourbon glass onto the patio table with a loud clatter and sprinted toward the driveway. He was waving his arms wildly, his voice cracking as he demanded to know what they thought they were doing. He shouted that they had the wrong house, the wrong car, and the wrong man. He aggressively puffed out his chest and threatened to call the police, claiming they were attempting to steal his private property right out of his sister's driveway. The repo agent holding the tablet did not even flinch. He had dealt with hundreds of fake millionaires throwing tantrums on suburban driveways. He calmly looked up from his screen and asked for Mark by his full legal name. When Mark aggressively confirmed his identity, the agent tapped the screen and read the unarguable facts aloud for the entire neighbourhood to hear. He stated clearly that the National Leasing Company had issued an immediate non-negotiable repossession order. The vehicle was exactly 60 days delinquent on its primary lease payments. Furthermore, the agent announced loudly the mandatory comprehensive auto insurance policy had been completely cancelled by the primary account holder, constituting a catastrophic breach of the leasing contract. The words hung in the humid summer air like a toxic cloud. 60 days delinquent, cancelled insurance. The family members standing on the patio exchanged shocked, uncomfortable glances. Emily covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with horror. Clara clutched her pearl necklace, physically swaying on her feet, as if she might collapse onto the expensive patio stones. The wealthy, untouchable corporate titan they had been worshipping all afternoon was currently being publicly outed as a deadbeat who could not even afford his car payments. Mark panicked. The facade was slipping, and he scrambled desperately to pull it back together. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out his personal debit card. He shoved it toward the repo agent, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer terror. He begged the man to just run the card, promising to pay the outstanding balance, the late fees, and whatever penalty they wanted right there, on the spot. He claimed it was just a stupid banking error and that he had thousands of dollars ready to clear the debt. The repo agent let out a dry, humorless laugh. He did not even reach for the piece of plastic. He looked Mark dead in the eye and explained that field agents do not operate mobile cash registers. The account was permanently closed by the leasing bank. The vehicle was going to the impound lot immediately, and Mark would have to call the corporate collections department on Monday morning if he wanted to beg for his car back. The agent turned his back on my husband and signalled his partner to engage the hydraulic lift. The mechanical whine of the truck gears filled the silence as the front end of the pristine sedan was hoisted unceremoniously into the air. The agent pulled out a roll of bright orange tamper-evident security tape. He walked around the suspended vehicle, slapping the thick stickers across the door seams and the trunk lid sealing the car completely. It was the ultimate visual marker of financial failure. By now, the spectacle had drawn an audience. Several neighbours from the surrounding luxury houses had stepped out onto their front porches. People walking their dogs stopped on the sidewalk to watch the drama unfold. I remained seated on my lounge chair, holding my glass of iced tea. I did not break a sweat. I watched the heavy truck secure the luxury vehicle and pull out of the drive with the flashing amber lights reflecting off the surrounding houses. Mark stood completely alone on the empty concrete pad. His shoulders slumped, his tailored shirt suddenly looking cheap and oversized. He was stripped of his vehicle, his dignity, and his manufactured identity in front of everyone he cared about. I glanced over at the barbecue grill. David was still standing there, arms crossed over his chest, his face an impenetrable mask. He watched the tow truck disappear down the street, then slowly turned his head to look at me. Emily stepped out from the patio covering, staring at her brother with a profound mixture of pity and shock. The silent exchange between us all confirmed everything. The absolute destruction of Mark had officially begun in earnest, and the silence that followed the tow truck was heavier than any argument we had ever had. The heavy rumble of the commercial tow truck faded down the suburban street, taking the very last shred of my husband and his fabricated reality with it. The silence that fell over the backyard patio was absolute and completely suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke. The upbeat summer music playing from the outdoor speakers felt entirely inappropriate against the backdrop of total financial ruin. Mark stood alone on the empty concrete driveway for several long seconds. He stared at the empty space where his luxury sedan had just been physically seized. I watched his chest heave as he took in rapid, shallow breaths. The initial shock was wearing off, and the sheer, unadulterated panic was instantly morphing into violent, defensive desperation. He needed a scapegoat to survive this public execution of his fragile ego, and he locked his bloodshot eyes entirely on me. He pivoted on his heel and marched back onto the patio. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, screaming that this was entirely my fault. He aggressively lied to his mother, to Emily, and to the small crowd of stunned relatives. He shouted that I was completely responsible for the household accounting, and that I had maliciously neglected to transfer the funds just to ruin his professional reputation. He tried to spin a desperate, pathetic narrative painting me as a jealous, incompetent wife who was actively trying to sabotage his prestigious career because I resented his recent promotion. I did not cower. I did not shrink back into my shaded lounge chair. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my simple sundress, and stepped directly into the centre of the patio. I refused to let him control the narrative for a single second longer. I did not scream, but I projected my voice clearly and articulately so that every guest and the neighbours peeking over the cedar fences caught every single syllable. I did not forget to pay anything Markway announced, my voice slicing through the humid air like a surgical scalpel. You explicitly demanded a strict 50-50 financial split in our household. You leased that luxury vehicle solely under your own name. You signed the dealership paperwork. Therefore, you are entirely responsible for the monthly payments and the comprehensive insurance coverage. Mark opened his mouth to shout another desperate lie, but I stepped closer, forcing him to physically step back. I let a tone of mock confusion enter my voice, playing directly to the audience he had cultivated all afternoon. Furthermore, I continued loudly. Did you not just spend the past hour boasting to everyone here about your massive year-end bonus? Did you not just brag about buying a vacation home entirely in cash? If you are rolling in corporate wealth and dominating boardroom negotiations, why exactly did your car just get repossessed for being 60 days delinquent? The family members gasped audibly. Clara let out a muffled, horrified sob, burying her face in her manicured hands. Emily stared at her brother, the grand illusion of his untouchable success completely shattered into a million pieces. Mark was entirely trapped. His grandiose lies were colliding violently with irrefutable reality right in front of his most valued audience. Cornered animals lash out, and Mark was absolutely no exception. His face turned a dangerous mottled shade of purple. Realizing he could not win this argument with logic or facts, he resorted to his ultimate cowardly threat. He screamed that I was a psychotic, vindictive woman. He shouted that our marriage was officially over. He threw his arms wide and loudly declared to the entire yard that he was calling a high-powered attorney to file for a divorce first thing Monday morning. He viciously promised to drag me through the state courts and strip me of every single asset I possessed. He boasted that he would take half of my consulting business, half of our house, and leave me completely destitute. He sneered, his spit flying into the warm air, claiming his legal team would destroy my life and that he would be the one laughing when he cashed out his 50% of my hard-earned money. While Mark threw his theatrical screaming tantrum, the true danger to his existence was unfolding quietly in the background. David had retreated from the smoking barbecue grill. He stepped back into the deep shade of the patio awning, completely unnoticed by the screaming man and the weeping mother. David leaned his broad shoulders against the brick exterior of the house, his face an impenetrable mask of absolute chilling calm. He was actively calculating the massive corporate fraud that Mark had just foolishly confessed to completely separate from the marital drama. I stood my ground on the patio stones, listening to the man I had supported for 7 years threaten to destroy my entire life. He truly believed his loud, aggressive performance was striking fear into my heart. He genuinely thought that threatening me with a divorce would finally force me to surrender and beg for his forgiveness. He was completely oblivious to the fact that he was currently threatening a woman who had already accepted the end of the relationship and who was already holding all the cards. The foundation of our marriage was not just threatened, it was already completely pulverized, and I was absolutely ready to sweep up the remaining dust. The echoes of his vicious threats faded into the warm suburban air. He stood there on the patio stones, breathing heavily, completely convinced he had finally terrified me into total submission. He expected me to fall apart, to beg him not to call his lawyers and to promise I would fix everything. Instead, I felt a deep, profound stillness settle over my entire body. I looked at the man I had loved for 7 long years and I realized there was absolutely nothing left to save. I did not raise my voice to match his aggressive volume. I stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us, and spoke with a quiet, heartbreaking honesty. You want 50% of my assets, Mark? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying perfectly across the silent yard. You want to drag me through the state courts and demand your rightful share of the wealth I have built. He glared at me, his jaw set in a stubborn defensive line, but the supreme confidence was beginning to flicker in his eyes. I kept my gaze locked entirely on his. Let me tell you exactly what your 50% looks like. I continued, my voice steady but thick with years of unshed tears. For the past 5 years, your logistics salary has not covered a single major bill in our home. Your paycheck barely covers your own tailored suits, your expensive golf habits, and the lavish business lunches you use to stroke your own fragile ego. Clara let out a sharp, audible gasp behind him, but I did not look away from my husband. I told him the absolute, unvarnished truth. I told him that I was the one who secretly transferred thousands of dollars into his personal checking account every single quarter just to keep his balance out of the negative. I detailed the heavy metal credit card in his wallet, explaining that it was backed entirely by my corporate consulting firm. I told him that every time he tossed that piece of plastic onto a restaurant table to impress his junior colleagues, I was the one quietly paying the massive bill at the end of the month. He tried to interrupt me to stammer out a pathetic denial, but the sheer weight of my words completely pinned him in place. I did not stop. I stripped away every single layer of the protective bubble I had built around him. I am the one who pays the soaring property taxes, Mark Y said softly, stepping even closer. I pay for the premium health insurance. I pay for the municipal utilities. I even paid for the comprehensive auto insurance on that luxury car that just got towed out of your sister driveway. Mark physically recoiled as if my words were physically striking him. The blood drained entirely from his face. His eyes darted wildly around the patio, realizing his entire family was listening to the absolute undeniable destruction of his fabricated wealth. But the money is not even the heaviest part, I whispered, feeling the raw, vulnerable truth rise in my chest. I looked at his expensive shoes and his designer shirt and then back up into his terrified eyes. Do you have any idea how profoundly exhausting it is to be the invisible shock absorber for your entire life? I have spent the last 7 years smoothing over every single consequence of your arrogance. I let a single tear slide down my cheek, not out of weakness, but out of sheer, overwhelming exhaustion. I told him about the countless nights I stayed awake until 3 a.m, staring at a bright computer screen, finalizing massive corporate contracts. I told him about falling asleep at the kitchen island, holding a cold cup of coffee, just so I could wake up at 6 to make sure his clothes were perfectly pressed and his lunch was packed. I loved you so much, Mark. I confessed, my voice breaking slightly on his name. I loved you enough to make myself completely invisible just so you could feel seen. I wanted you to feel like the traditional provider you so desperately wanted to be. I swallowed my own pride. I hid my own massive success, and I carried the entire weight of our lives on my shoulders just to protect your fragile ego. The silence on the patio was absolutely deafening. Emily was quietly crying, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. David stood perfectly still, watching the devastating emotional climax unfold with deep, profound respect. Clara was completely speechless, her manicured hands covering her mouth, the grand illusion of her golden child completely annihilated. And how did you repay that sacrifice? I asked, my voice hardening with a quiet, resolute strength. You came home smelling of expensive bourbon and you looked at me with absolute disgust. You told me I was a financial burden. You demanded a strict 50-50 split because you were tired of subsidizing my life. I took one final step back, putting a physical boundary between us. You wanted separate lives, Mark, and now you have exactly that. You have zero access to my corporate wealth. You have zero access to my premium credit lines. You are completely and utterly on your own. Call your high-powered lawyers tomorrow morning. I genuinely welcome the legal mediation, because when the state courts audit our joint finances, they are not going to hand you half of my empire. They are going to hand you half of the massive, staggering debt you have secretly accumulated behind my back. I turned my back on him, leaving him standing completely paralyzed in the center of the patio. I did not need to scream to completely obliterate his reality. The quiet, devastating truth had already done all the necessary work. The silence that fell over the sprawling suburban backyard was heavier than any physical weight. I walked slowly across the manicured lawn, feeling the soft grass beneath my sandals, and I did not look back. I left Mark standing completely paralyzed in the center of the patio stones. The grand, boastful performance he had been conducting all afternoon was entirely dead. The upbeat pop music had stopped playing from the outdoor speakers, leaving only the soft rustling of the summer wind through the large oak trees. Mark stood perfectly still, staring at the empty space where I had just been standing. For the very first time in his adult life, he had absolutely no aggressive retort and no defensive lie to offer. The sheer overwhelming reality of my confession had completely disarmed him. He looked down at his expensive leather shoes and then at his tailored linen shirt. He suddenly realized with a sickening, dizzying drop in his stomach that he did not actually own any of it. He was a man wearing a costume funded entirely by the quiet, invisible labour of the woman he had just tried to destroy. The memories he had conveniently ignored for 7 years suddenly flooded his mind with terrifying clarity. He remembered walking into the kitchen late at night, finding me asleep at the marble island, surrounded by glowing screens and stacks of corporate paperwork. He remembered complaining that I never wanted to go out to expensive restaurants anymore, completely blind to the fact that I was physically exhausted from funding his daily life. He realized with crushing certainty that every time he felt like a powerful, successful provider, it was only because I was standing quietly in the shadows, holding the entire stage up with my bare hands. Clara let out a small, pathetic whimper, breaking the suffocating silence. The expensive cocktail glass slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered against the stone patio, sending small shards of glass flying across the ground. She did not even flinch. The wealthy, elite fantasy she had worshipped her entire life was completely annihilated. She looked at her golden child, the son she had bragged about to all her friends at the country club, and she finally saw him for what he truly was. He was not a corporate titan. He was a deeply insecure, negligent man who had financially drained a brilliant woman just to feed his own massive ego. Emily stepped forward carefully, avoiding the broken glass on the patio. She placed a gentle, supportive hand on her mother's shoulder and quietly suggested that it was time to go inside the house. The remaining extended family members, the aunts and cousins, who had been eagerly eating the expensive imported beef, awkwardly set their paper plates down. They began to shuffle toward the wooden side gate, avoiding eye contact with Mark entirely. The joyous family barbecue had rapidly turned into a deeply uncomfortable wake for a marriage that was officially dead. David stood near the outdoor kitchen, his face an impenetrable mask of quiet observation. He systematically turned the heavy dials on the barbecue grill, cutting off the gas supply and letting the flames die out completely. He picked up a clean towel and wiped his hands, looking at his brother-in-law with profound clinical pity. David knew the marital destruction was only the very beginning. The horrific corporate fraud Mark had casually confessed to earlier was still waiting in the shadows. But David remained completely silent, knowing that Mark was already drowning in the exact consequences of his own profound arrogance. Mark finally forced his heavy legs to move. He took a slow, unsteady step backward, leaning against the wooden railing of the patio. His chest heaved as the aggressive anger that usually fueled him completely evaporated. It was replaced by a deep, suffocating wave of absolute shame. He could not blame me for his failed car payments anymore. He could not blame me for his empty checking account. I had laid the undeniable truth completely bare in front of the exact people he desperately wanted to impress. He watched my figure disappear around the corner of the house, heading toward the front driveway. A new, terrifying reality suddenly crashed down upon him. He had insisted we ride to the party together in his leased luxury sedan because he wanted to show off. That vehicle was currently sitting in a municipal impound lot sealed with bright orange security tape. He had no car keys in his pocket. He had no valid credit card to call an expensive car service. He was stranded at his sister's house, completely exposed and entirely broke. He slowly sank down onto one of the expensive outdoor lounge chairs. He buried his flushed face in his hands, pressing his fingers deeply into his eyes. The protective bubble of his entitlement was completely shattered. He had demanded a strict 50-50 split because he genuinely believed he was carrying a heavy burden. He had absolutely no idea that he was the burden all along. I reached the quiet street and unlocked my sleek, fully paid-off vehicle. I slid into the comfortable driver's seat and closed the heavy door, shutting out the noise of the suburban neighborhood. I started the engine, feeling the smooth, reliable vibration of the car. Mark muttered a quiet thank you and walked slowly up the front pathway, feeling like a complete stranger in his own life. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind him. The house was completely dark except for a single warm light glowing softly in the kitchen. I'd already gone upstairs to sleep, leaving him entirely alone with his thoughts. The profound, crushing quiet of the house amplified his massive failure. For years he had walked into this entryway, expecting to be greeted as the returning hero. Tonight he walked in as a broken, humiliated fraud. He dropped his expensive keys onto the console table, the metallic clatter echoing painfully in the empty hallway. He walked slowly toward the kitchen, drawn by the single glowing lamp. Resting directly under the warm circle of light on the marble kitchen island was a thick grey folder. I had left it there, deliberately, before going upstairs. Mark stood at the counter, staring at the thick cardboard cover for a very long time. He knew exactly what was inside. It was the absolute unvarnished truth of our entire 7-year marriage. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out and slowly flipped the heavy cover open. He was finally ready to look at the reality he had so desperately avoided. The very first page was a highly detailed chronological spreadsheet. It documented every single utility bill, property tax payment, and premium insurance fee for the past 5 years. Mark traced his finger down the neat printed columns. He saw the massive recurring numbers that he had never once bothered to ask about. He saw the exact cost of the imported grocery items he consumed every single week. He saw the exorbitant, staggering monthly payments for the luxury car he no longer possessed. He realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that his entire logistics salary barely covered a third of the actual household operating costs. He turned the page, and the devastating reality grew even heavier. The next section contained printed bank statements from his own supposedly private checking account. I had highlighted the incoming transfers in a bright neon yellow marker. He saw the dates clearly. Every time he had taken his junior colleagues out for lavish steakhouse dinners, his account balance had dipped dangerously close to zero. And every single time, usually around 2 a.m, a quiet transfer of $500 or sometimes a full $1,000 miraculously appeared in his ledger. The money always originated from my corporate consulting firm. He flipped to the final section of the folder. It contained the complete billing history of the heavy metal travel card he loved to flash at the local golf course. He stared at the itemized list of expensive rounds of drinks, designer golf apparel, and luxurious business lunches. At the bottom of each monthly statement, the massive, overwhelming balance was paid in full. The payment source was clearly listed as my primary business account. He had spent years bragging to his friends about his high corporate limits and his elite banking status. He finally saw the undeniable proof that he possessed absolutely no status at all. Mark closed the thick grey folder. He leaned heavily against the cool marble countertop. His legs suddenly felt incredibly weak, and he slid down until he was sitting completely on the hardwood floor of the kitchen. He pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms tightly around his legs. The defensive, arrogant anger that had fueled him for years was entirely gone. It was completely replaced by a deep, suffocating and profound wave of absolute shame. He sat in the quiet, dim kitchen, surrounded by the expensive appliances and the custom cabinetry. He realized that he did not build this beautiful life. He had simply been an ungrateful guest living comfortably inside the massive protective fortress I had built with my own 2 hands. He had demanded a strict 50-50 split from the very woman who was actively holding his entire world together. He closed his eyes and let the first genuine, agonizing tears of true remorse fall down his face. The painful aftermath had finally arrived, and the necessary rebuilding of his soul had just begun. I woke up around 2 a.m. The house was completely silent. I felt a strange, heavy stillness in the air. I walked out of the master bedroom and stepped onto the carpeted landing. I looked down the stairs and saw a faint, warm light spilling from the kitchen. I walked slowly down the wooden steps, my bare feet making absolutely no sound against the polished floorboards. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, I heard a low, ragged breath. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak echoing in the quiet space. I stepped into the kitchen entryway and stopped completely. Mark was sitting entirely on the hardwood floor, his back pressed firmly against the lower cabinets. The thick grey financial folder was resting on the marble island directly above him. His face was buried deep in his hands. His shoulders were shaking with quiet, heavy sobs. I had never seen my husband cry in the entire 7 years of our marriage. He had always believed that tears were a sign of weakness, a fundamental failure of his masculine duty. Seeing him broken sitting on the cold floor in his expensive wrinkled shirt shifted something deep inside my chest. The arrogant posture was completely gone. The defensive anger that had carried me through the entire weekend began to slowly dissolve into the quiet night. I did not feel the need to gloat or deliver another crushing speech about his massive failures. The unvarnished truth had already done all the necessary devastating work. I walked slowly across the kitchen floor, the hem of my long robe brushing softly against the wood. I did not stand over him, towering like a victorious judge. I slowly lowered myself down, folding my legs until I was sitting on the floor right across from him. The physical space between us was small, but it held the heavy weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. He slowly lifted his head when he heard the soft rustle of my clothes. His eyes were incredibly red, and his face was stained with raw tears. He looked at me not with the arrogant smirk of a corporate director, but with the terrified, vulnerable eyes of a man who had just lost his entire, fabricated identity. "I am so incredibly sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking and breaking in the quiet kitchen. I did not say anything immediately. I simply let his apology hang in the warm air, giving it the necessary space it desperately needed to breathe. I looked at the folder on the island. He continued, his voice barely above a ragged whisper. "I saw the bank transfers and the credit card statements. I saw exactly what you have been doing for me for all these long years. I have been so completely blind and so incredibly stupid. I took everything you gave me and I threw it right back in your face." I folded my hands quietly in my lap, looking at his defeated, slumped posture. "Why did you do it, Mark?" I asked softly, keeping my tone perfectly even. "Why did you push me away and demand that strict 50-50 split when you knew deep down you were struggling?" He leaned his head back against the wooden cabinet and closed his weary eyes. "Because I was absolutely terrified," he confessed, the painful truth finally spilling out of him. "When we first met, you were already so brilliant and so driven. You were building your successful consulting firm, and I was just a junior employee desperately trying to figure out my life. I loved you so much, but I felt so incredibly small standing next to you." He opened his eyes and looked directly into mine, stripping away the last remnants of his pride. "I grew up with a mother who constantly told me that a real man provides entirely for his family." He explained, his voice thick with painful, deeply ingrained memories. "She taught me that a man's entire worth is tied exclusively to his paycheck and his job title. When you started making massive amounts of money working quietly from this very kitchen, I felt like a complete failure. I felt like I was not a real husband to you." I listened to his raw, vulnerable confession, feeling a deep ache forming in my chest. "You tried to build a fake empire, just to match mine," I said softly, finally understanding the tragic, deeply flawed logic behind his destructive actions. He nodded slowly, fresh tears falling freely down his face. "I bought the expensive suits and the luxury car because I thought it would make me feel completely equal to you," he whispered. "I threw those heavy credit cards on the restaurant tables to impress my junior colleagues because I desperately needed someone to look at me with genuine respect. But deep down I knew it was all a complete fragile lie. I knew I was secretly drowning in debt. And every time I looked at you I felt a massive wave of shame because you were the only one keeping me from going under." He reached out his hand, hovering over the hardwood floor, completely terrified to bridge the physical gap between us. I thought if I demanded a 50-50 split, I could finally force myself to step up. He admitted, his voice breaking into a quiet sob. "I thought I could bully my way into being a real traditional provider. I never wanted to hurt you, Sarah. I just hated myself so much, and I took all of that profound hatred directly out on you." I looked at his trembling hand and the absolute undeniable devastation in his eyes. The defensive walls he had built over 7 years were completely destroyed. He was finally standing in the absolute truth, completely bare and deeply flawed. The arrogant, toxic corporate director was entirely gone. The frightened, deeply insecure man he truly was finally asking for grace. I reached out and gently placed my hand over his trembling fingers. I did not promise that everything would magically be fixed. I did not tell him that his actions were perfectly fine or easily forgiven. But I held his hand in the quiet, dim kitchen, acknowledging the incredibly painful, necessary step he had finally taken. The heavy, invisible burden of his profound insecurity was finally out in the open, resting quietly between us on the kitchen floor. I held his trembling hand, feeling the cold air of the kitchen settling around us. I did not pull away, but I did not offer a false comfort. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence wrap around us for a few more seconds. "I appreciate your honesty, Mark," I whispered, my voice echoing slightly in the large room. "But understanding why you built the lie does not erase the sheer devastation it caused in my life. You were terrified of feeling small," I continued, looking directly into his red, swollen eyes. "But in your desperate attempt to feel tall, you made me completely invisible. You looked at me every single day, and you saw exactly what you wanted to see. You saw a woman who stayed home, who kept the kitchen pristine, and who miraculously never asked you for a single dime. You never once stopped to ask how the magic actually happened." I squeezed his fingers slightly, grounding us both in the painful reality. Do you know what it feels like, Mark, to sit at a dinner party and listen to your husband tell everyone he is the sole provider? Do you know how much it hurts to smile politely while your own mother calls me lazy, knowing full well my bank account is paying for her expensive country club salads? I swallowed all of that intense humiliation because I loved you and I wanted you to be happy. Mark flinched as if the words were physically striking him. He looked down at our joined hands, his tears falling steadily onto the hardwood floor. I told him about the mornings, when my hands physically shook from pure exhaustion as I poured his dark roast coffee. I told him how profoundly lonely it felt to share a bed with a man who lived in a completely different financial universe. I explained that my silence was born out of love, but it slowly turned into a heavy, suffocating resentment. Every time he tossed his premium credit card onto a restaurant table to impress his junior colleagues, a small piece of my respect for him quietly died. But I have to own my part in this destruction. I admitted, letting a heavy tear fall onto my silk robe. I was absolutely wrong to hide the financial reality from you. I thought I was being a good supportive wife. I thought I was protecting your masculine pride by quietly paying off your massive credit card bills behind your back. I thought love meant absorbing your mistakes without ever letting you feel the harsh impact. I created a completely false reality for you, Mark. I whispered, my voice thick with absolute sorrow. I built a beautifully padded cell where you never had to face a single consequence. And because you never felt the sharp friction of real life, you grew deeply entitled. You grew incredibly arrogant. I allowed you to believe that your logistics salary was a massive fortune because I was too terrified to have a difficult conversation about money. I looked around the dark kitchen, taking in the expensive appliances and the custom marble countertops. My silence was not a precious gift, Mark, I stated firmly, bringing my gaze back to his face. It was a terrible, destructive mistake. I treated you like a fragile child who could not handle the truth instead of treating you like a capable, equal partner. By constantly acting as your invisible shock absorber, I completely prevented you from growing up. Mark listened to every single word, his head bowed, the tears continuing to fall silently onto his expensive, wrinkled shirt. He did not interrupt me. He did not try to justify his past behavior or shift the blame back onto my shoulders. He did not talk about his stressful corporate job or his overbearing mother. He simply absorbed the profound weight of my broken heart. You were protecting me, he whispered, his voice thick with absolute, undeniable grief. And I rewarded your quiet protection by treating you like a complete burden. I was so blinded by my own massive ego and my deep fear of failure that I could not see the incredible woman standing right in front of me. You were drowning, Sarah, and I was actively standing on your shoulders just to keep my own head above the water. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a terrifying, raw clarity. You are entirely right, he confessed, his voice trembling in the quiet room. You built a safe world for me, and I became an arrogant monster inside of it. I took your money, I took your time, and I took your boundless grace, and I used it all to fuel my own pathetic vanity. We sat on the cold hardwood floor for a very long time, mourning the 7 years we had completely wasted on a toxic, fabricated illusion. We cried together, not with the loud, dramatic weeping of a suburban soap opera, but with the quiet, devastating tears of 2 adults finally facing the absolute truth. The kitchen felt incredibly large, and the night felt endlessly dark, but the suffocating pressure in my chest was finally beginning to lift. We were no longer playing our carefully rehearsed roles. We were no longer the arrogant corporate director and the invisible submissive wife. We were just 2 deeply flawed humans sitting in the wreckage of a broken marriage, trying to understand how we had lost our way. The conversation was incredibly painful, but it was entirely free of the toxic gaslighting and the defensive anger that had plagued us for years. For the very first time in our entire relationship, we were finally speaking the exact same language, and the absolute honesty felt like a sudden rush of clean oxygen into a burning room. The pale early morning light finally began to filter through the large kitchen windows. It cast a soft grey glow over the custom marble island. We had been sitting on the cold hardwood floor for hours. My legs were numb, and my eyes were completely swollen from the heavy, exhausting tears. Mark let out a long, shaky breath. He slowly pushed himself up from the hard ground. He reached his hand down to me, his palm open and entirely vulnerable. I looked at his hand for a long moment before placing my fingers softly inside his. He pulled me up gently, and we stood in the quiet kitchen, facing the absolute wreckage of our past. We moved to the marble island, pulling out the heavy wooden bar stools. I sat down, wrapping my silk robe tightly around my shoulders. Mark did not pour a drink, and he did not reach for his smartphone. He sat directly across from me, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on my tired face. The silence was no longer suffocating, but it was incredibly heavy with the weight of the massive task ahead of us. The petty 50-50 rule is officially dissolved, I stated quietly, my voice raspy from crying. It was a toxic, punishing game, and we are completely done playing it in this house. Mark nodded slowly, accepting the absolute end of his foolish demand. I do not want separate lives, Sarah, he replied, his voice filled with a quiet, desperate honesty. I want to build a real partnership, but I honestly do not know exactly how to begin. We begin with absolute, unflinching transparency, I told him, leaning forward slightly, resting my hands on the cool marble. The invisible safety net is permanently gone, Mark. I will never secretly transfer funds into your checking account again. I will never quietly pay off your premium credit cards behind your back. If you cannot afford a luxury item on your own logistics salary, then you simply do not buy it. He swallowed hard the reality of his massive accumulated debt, settling heavily on his broad shoulders. He knew he was facing a mountain of high-interest payments and severe financial penalties from the repossessed luxury car. I have to call the corporate leasing company on Monday morning, he admitted, his face flushing with fresh, painful shame. I have to find out exactly how much I owe them for completely breaking the auto contract. Yes, you do, I agreed, offering absolutely no false comfort to soften the blow. And you are going to sell your expensive golf clubs to help cover that specific penalty. You are going to cancel your luxury gym membership, and you are going to bring a packed lunch to the office every single day. The fabricated millionaire lifestyle is completely over. You are going to live entirely within the absolute reality of your own actual income. I expected him to argue or throw a defensive tantrum about his corporate image, but the arrogant, toxic executive was truly gone. I will sell the clubs tomorrow, he promised, his voice completely steady and resolute. I will sit down with David and ask him to help me build a strict, aggressive budget to pay off my personal debt. I do not want to hide from my massive failures anymore. I felt a small, fragile spark of genuine hope ignite deeply in my chest. But the financial transparency is only half of the required equation. I reminded him, my tone softening slightly. I need absolute emotional respect, Mark. I need you to see my true value even when I am sitting at this island wearing comfortable sweatpants and drinking a cold cup of coffee. My corporate consulting work is not a little freelance hobby. It is a highly successful career, and I demand that you respect the immense effort it takes to build it. I respect it, Sarah, he whispered, reaching across the marble counter to gently touch my hand. I am in absolute awe of you, and I am so incredibly ashamed that it took a massive public humiliation for me to finally open my eyes. I promise you I will never dismiss your hard work or your quiet sacrifices again. I looked at his earnest, tear-stained face. The long road ahead of us was going to be incredibly difficult. Rebuilding a shattered foundation takes time, patience, and a tremendous amount of painful daily work. There was no magical instantaneous fix for 7 years of deep resentments and hidden financial secrets. But for the very first time in our relationship, we were standing on solid, completely honest ground. We are going to open a joint household checking account, I explained clearly, outlining the new healthy boundaries of our shared life. We will sit down at this exact island on the first day of every single month, and we will review every single bill together. We will divide the living expenses based on a realistic, proportional percentage of our actual incomes. You will contribute your fair share, and you will physically press the button to pay the utility bills. You are going to learn exactly how much it actually costs to keep the lights on and the water running in this house. I want to do exactly that. He agreed eagerly, practically begging for the shared responsibility. I want to be a real equal partner in this marriage. I want to carry my own weight. I took a slow sip of the cold green tea that I had abandoned many hours ago. The bitter, earthy taste grounded me firmly in the present moment. We will take it one single day at a time, I told him quietly, looking directly into his eyes. You have to earn my trust back, Mark. It is not going to happen overnight, and I am not going to blindly trust your empty promises without seeing consistent, reliable action. I understand, he said, giving my hand a gentle, reassuring squeeze. I will spend the rest of my life actively proving to you that I can be the man you actually deserve. The bright morning light finally broke completely through the large kitchen windows. It cast a warm, beautiful golden glow across the marble island. We were both physically and emotionally exhausted, entirely drained from the massive outpouring of vulnerable truth. But the suffocating heavy tension that had plagued our home for weeks was completely gone. The quiet, expansive house no longer felt like a toxic battlefield, waiting for the next explosive argument. We stood up from the heavy bar stools, moving slowly, our bodies aching from the severe emotional toll. We walked up the carpeted stairs together, side by side. We left the thick grey financial folder resting openly on the kitchen counter. We did not need to hide it in the dark safe anymore. The damaging secrets were all exposed. The toxic rules were completely dissolved, and the painful, beautifully necessary work of true reconciliation had officially begun. Exactly 6 months had passed since that long, devastating night on the cold kitchen floor. The stifling, suffocating heat of the summer finally faded into a crisp, bright autumn. The sprawling suburban house felt entirely different now. It was no longer a silent, toxic battlefield filled with hidden resentments and unpaid bills. It was actually a home. I woke up at 6:00 on a cool Tuesday morning. The space beside me in the large bed was already completely empty. I did not feel a sudden rush of panic or a heavy, sinking wave of dread. I stretched my arms, pulling the warm duvet over my shoulders, and listened to the quiet, comforting sounds coming from downstairs. I heard the low mechanical hum of the coffee grinder. I heard the refrigerator door opening and closing very softly. I slipped out of bed, put on my favourite silk robe, and walked slowly down the carpeted stairs. I stepped into the bright kitchen and paused quietly in the doorway. Mark was standing at the marble island. He wore a simple, unwrinkled dress shirt and a pair of dark trousers. He was not sitting impatiently, waiting for me to serve him his breakfast. He was actively packing his own lunch, placing a humble turkey sandwich into a reusable plastic container. He poured a steaming cup of dark roast coffee and set it gently on the counter, exactly where I usually sat. He looked up and smiled warmly at me. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, his voice entirely free of the old toxic arrogance. "I made your favourite blend today." I smiled back, walking over to the marble island and wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic mug. "Thank you, Mark," I replied softly, taking a slow, comforting sip. He closed his lunch container and placed it inside his modest nylon briefcase. Resting directly next to his briefcase was a printed electricity bill. He did not ignore it. He did not shove it away blindly, assuming my corporate checking account would miraculously absorb the massive cost. He picked up a black pen and carefully wrote a reminder on the top right corner of the paper. "I will log into the joint household account and pay this on my lunch break," he promised. Tapping the paper gently, "My portion of the grocery budget automatically transfers into the shared fund tomorrow morning." I watched him organize his daily administrative tasks, feeling a profound, quiet peace settle deep inside my chest. The massive, invisible burden was finally gone. He was carrying his own actual weight. He walked to the entryway and picked up his car keys. They were not the heavy premium keys of a leased luxury sports car. He had kept his desperate promise to his brother-in-law David. He immediately sold his expensive golf clubs, his designer watches and his tailored suits. He used the cash to buy a reliable 5-year-old used sedan. It was a humble vehicle completely devoid of status or corporate prestige. But it was entirely paid for, and it transported him to his logistics company perfectly fine. He was aggressively paying down his massive credit card debt, living strictly on a tightly managed budget. His entire dynamic with his toxic family had also fundamentally shifted. Clara had tried to invite him to an expensive charity gala just 3 weeks ago. She desperately wanted him to buy a premium table to show off his fabricated wealth to her country club friends. In the past, Mark would have secretly charged the massive fee to my hidden travel card just to buy her conditional love. This time he politely but firmly declined her extravagant invitation. He told his mother directly that a premium charity gala was completely outside of his strict personal budget. Clara had thrown a loud, dramatic tantrum, accusing him of embarrassing the family. But Mark simply hung up the phone, completely unbothered by her psychological manipulation. He was finally standing on his own 2 feet, entirely refusing to be moulded by her toxic, impossible expectations. "Have a wonderful day at work, Sarah," he said, pausing at the front door. He walked back into the kitchen, wrapped his arms gently around my waist, and kissed the top of my head. He smelled like simple soap and fresh coffee, not the heavy, expensive cologne of a fake millionaire. "I will be home by exactly 6:00, he added, offering a genuine smile. "And it is my turn to cook dinner tonight." The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. I sat alone at the kitchen island drinking my warm coffee. The house was incredibly quiet, but it was a beautiful, deeply comforting silence. The exhausting, lonely era of my silent sacrifices was permanently over. Our evenings were no longer spent in entirely separate rooms consumed by cold resentment. We cooked simple meals together, standing shoulder to shoulder at the exact same marble island. We talked about our days without him constantly dominating the conversation with fabricated tales of corporate glory. He asked about my complex data analytics, and he actually listened to my answers with profound, undeniable respect. The painful, necessary realignment had saved our fragile marriage from absolute destruction. I opened my laptop, ready to start my consulting work. For the very first time in 7 long years, I felt completely supported, entirely safe, and genuinely seen inside my own beautiful home. Later that afternoon, I closed my laptop for the final time. The major corporate project was entirely complete and successfully submitted. I stretched my arms above my head and walked away from the marble island. I brewed a fresh cup of warm chamomile tea. I opened the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the wide back porch. The autumn air was crisp and incredibly refreshing. The massive oak trees in our sprawling backyard were beginning to shed their golden leaves. They drifted slowly down, resting quietly on the manicured green lawn. I sat down on the comfortable wicker chair, wrapping a soft woven blanket around my shoulders. I held the warm ceramic mug in my hands and let the profound stillness of the evening wash over me. I looked out at the empty space on the stone patio where Mark had stood exactly 6 months ago. I remembered the sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes when the commercial tow truck pulled his luxury car away. I remembered the heavy, suffocating silence of our entire extended family, watching his fabricated empire crumble to dust. It had been an incredibly painful day, filled with devastating anger and absolute public humiliation. But sitting here now, feeling the cool breeze against my face, I realized it was the most necessary day of our entire lives. I used to firmly believe that a strong marriage meant hiding all the ugly parts. I thought that shielding him from failure and quietly absorbing his massive financial mistakes was an act of profound love. I was completely wrong. True love requires absolute unflinching honesty. It requires letting the people we care about deeply face the natural harsh consequences of their own arrogant choices. Our life together is completely imperfect now. We do not go on lavish vacations to expensive tropical resorts. We do not eat premium imported beef or dine at high-end steakhouses downtown. We spend our quiet weekends sitting together at the kitchen island, meticulously reviewing budgeting spreadsheets. We are aggressively paying down his massive personal debt, $1 single at a time. There are certainly moments when the old familiar insecurities flare up. There are challenging days when the dark ghosts of his past arrogance try to creep back into the quiet house. But we do not let them stay. We talk about the deep fears and the lingering shame out loud. We do not hide from each other in entirely separate rooms anymore. We face the absolute reality of our lives completely together. The extended family dynamic has also shifted into a much healthier space. Emily and David come over for simple, casual dinners. We eat inexpensive pasta, and we genuinely laugh without the suffocating pressure of maintaining a wealthy facade. Clara still calls occasionally, but Mark sets firm, undeniable boundaries with her. He does not allow her toxic, status-driven manipulation to dictate his daily choices. He is finally his own man, completely free from the heavy burden of pretending to be someone he is not. I took a slow, comforting sip of my warm tea. The gentle autumn breeze brushed against my face, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. I finally felt a deep, unwavering sense of profound self-worth. I had successfully reclaimed my voice. I was no longer the invisible, submissive wife working silently in the dark shadows. My highly successful consulting firm was finally acknowledged and deeply respected in my own home. But more importantly, my massive emotional labor was fully recognized and completely valued. The sound of tires crunching gently on the driveway pulled me from my quiet thoughts. I heard the heavy front door open and close softly. Familiar, steady footsteps walked through the quiet house. A moment later, Mark stepped out onto the back porch. He had changed out of his work clothes into a comfortable knit sweater and faded denim jeans. He carried 2 simple plates filled with roasted vegetables and grilled chicken. "Dinner is served, Sarah," he announced softly, setting the warm plates down on the small wooden table directly between our wicker chairs. I smiled brightly and thanked him. He sat down beside me, letting out a long, contented sigh. We did not need to fill the quiet evening with loud, empty boasts or fabricated stories of corporate domination. We simply sat together in the fading light, watching the golden leaves fall onto the grass. We shared a humble, healthy meal that he had prepared completely with his own 2 hands. We had survived the massive, terrifying collapse of our toxic illusion. We had successfully rebuilt our entire world on a solid foundation of unvarnished truth and shared burdens. The heavy, invisible weight was finally gone. As we sat quietly on the back porch, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, the future felt incredibly and beautifully light. True partnership is not measured by equal bank statements, but by the shared weight of invisible burdens. When we set honest boundaries, we invite our loved ones to see our true value. Love thrives not in silent sacrifice, but in mutual respect, open truth, and gracefully shared responsibilities.